Hello there. Our service this morning at New Road was once again on Zoom, so here you'll be able to find the sermon from that service. And it carries on in some respects from last week's sermon, in that the reading is that from the verses straight after it in Matthew chapter 18. So it's Matthew 18 verses 21 to 35 as we continue exploring the restoration of relationships and the nature of forgiveness. Now, Peter has just heard Jesus speak about resolving conflict and restoring damaged relationships between church members through honest conversation, repentance and reconciliation. And upon hearing this, there are some questions burning in his mind. Because this thing that Jesus is talking about seems like flipping hard work. So he wonders, how many times are we expected to do this? Surely there's a limit to the number of offences a disciple is allowed to commit before they're kicked out of the community. So he picks what in his mind is an impressive number and asks Jesus, how many times should I forgive? As many as 7 times. Now you get the impression that he'd prefer that Jesus would give a smaller number. 5 times, or even 3 times would surely suffice. But Jesus answers in such a way as to make the number irrelevant. 77 times. Now who in their right mind would count up to a total of 77 offences? Well, we might know some people like that, but that isn't the point. Peter wants a number, and that is pretty understandable. It's by numbers that we often comprehend the scale of things. We measure them, quantify them, give things a value and a number. We keep score. In the news at present, we hear a lot of numbers. In a lot of the time, it's referring to things related to coronavirus. The number of cases. The R number, that's the number of people each infected person is estimated to pass on the infection to. The number of people who are allowed to gather together in one place. The number of households that can mix. Numbers everywhere. And of course, people approach and interpret the numbers in different ways. Some follow the numbers wholeheartedly. Others view them as an approximate guideline that doesn't really apply to them. Some view the limits as not being strict enough and would only approach those limits if entirely necessary. Others spend time in a group of 6 whenever it is possible, and if one person leaves, another would join straight away. In a way, it's a bit like the approach to speed limits, I think. Another number that we abide by. Some view it as a guideline. Others see it as a speed that must be met at all times, and others drive so slowly that they never reach the limit anyway. Now Peter wants to know what the limits to forgiveness are. He wants a guideline so he knows when he can stop, and so that he knows he can give up on someone and move on. And so that the Christian community knows at what point someone can be excluded from their midst. Now, the problem with this is that such counting presupposes relationships where we're keeping score of how we're being treated by others. And it is, of course, easy to slip into such behaviour, counting the number of grievances and weighing them up against moments of kindness. And it perhaps doesn't help that such ways of thinking dominate in the workplace, with 3 strikes and you're out when it comes to discipline, productivity scores, 6 days counted and triggering hearings with HR, even appraisals where scores are given to a whole host of things related to the job. Now, this keeping of score, of course, can even permeate the way in which we think about our relationship with God. For the Israelites, this score was kept in terms of sacrificial offerings at the temple, the sins of the community at times placed onto scapegoats in order to placate the wrath of God. In Christianity, when we think about forgiveness, Often we think of a penance that has to be done in order to gain absolution, and that's particularly the case in the Roman Catholic tradition. Absolution is given as long as this penance is carried out, and I remember going to the confessional in a Roman Catholic school, and it always seemed to be kind of an arbitrary number of Our Fathers or Hail Marys that needed to be said. And I know it's a deeper thing than that, but in a sense it felt like having to rebalance the scales. And of course there's the image that we sometimes think of as we meet Paul at the pearly gates, who is equipped with scales weighing up our good and bad deeds to see if we can gain entry into heaven. Yet what we know of Christ blows all of this scorekeeping out of the water, and putting such values on sin and forgiveness, no matter how much we like to do it, can only lead us into a minefield of problems. First, it can be that we simply try and play a system. It doesn't necessarily demand a changed attitude or way of thinking. If we can keep score of things, then we can choose to do the bare minimum to get by. And if we ask that question at all in our relationships, like what's the minimum that's expected of me, then we have a problem. As following Jesus and maintaining our relationship with God and with other people cannot be done on a bare minimum kind of basis. It would be like looking at an exam syllabus and through past papers and working out how many sections of the paper that you can afford to ignore while still managing to get a pass. Now, such cynical behaviour does not belong in the kingdom, and it does not bear any resemblance to forgiveness as Jesus describes it, or the forgiveness that Jesus reveals to us as he's crucified. As even then, in the midst of betrayal, injustice, and at the peak of human sin, he cries out the words, "Father, forgive them." Now, the forgiveness that comes through Christ, therefore, cannot be quantified, in the same way that God's love and God's grace cannot be exhausted. Neither can his forgiveness. And in light of such forgiveness that we experience when we know the presence of God in our lives, then we should find that we have no option but to forgive others. And not through clenched teeth, or not whilst taking tally of the number of sins that have been forgiven, but forgiving abundantly and wholeheartedly in such a way that our relationships can be renewed and those who have sinned against us can be reconciled to us and to God. Now, the parable that Jesus tells places great emphasis on the need to forgive others as we have been forgiven. It likens sin to a debt that is owed. You see, even the gospel, it seems, is aware of our need to quantify everything. And a large debt is cancelled by the king of a man who's about to be imprisoned as a result of his failure to pay his dues. But when he begs for forgiveness and promises to put things right, then he's let off his debt. But then, faced with a servant who owes him money, the man whose debt has been cancelled refuses to do likewise, and he throws the debtor into prison. Now, the consequences for the one who failed to pass on the forgiveness that they experienced were severe, to the point where we might say it seems that there's limits to God's forgiveness. The harshest judgment here is reserved for those who have experienced forgiveness themselves, but fail to pass it on to others. Now, that is a bit of a scary thought, because forgiveness is pretty hard. Even when we think we've forgiven someone, something else might happen that brings up our bad feelings again, years down the line. Or memories pop into our head, and at times we could stop and think about how we treat others and realise that there's instances in our lives where we continue to treat some people worse than we do others, simply because of long past misdemeanours or grievances. Now, where these things are present in our lives, it's clear that forgiveness has not been fulfilled. Forgiveness heals damaged relationships. It restores people to the point where we should no longer be showing prejudice against someone for their past mistakes. In some cases, this can take many attempts, and we might find that there's a very long road to travel down before we can even get close to forgiving someone completely. Yet no matter how difficult the journey is, we are called to be a forgiving people. Those who forgive others as we have been forgiven ourselves. This is therefore something that should become a way of life, not something that can be tallied up, rather a mode of being, a lens through which we look at the world, and a lens through which we maintain our relationships with other people. Of course, we might well say the same of God's love and of God's grace. It's through them that we see and interact with the world around us. It's only transformed by the love of God, transformed by his grace at work in our lives, and transformed in light of his forgiveness, that we can ever hope to forgive without counting the cost and keeping score. It can be very unsettling for us when we stop keeping score, when we forget the scales and leave the comfort of known targets and limits behind. But it's completely necessary if we're to move beyond the point where we are constrained by minimum requirements, and instead look to achieve the best that we can do by the grace of God in all situations, in all of our relationships, and at all times. Grounded in the boundless nature of Christ's forgiveness and the infinite nature of God's mercy and love, there can be no easy cop-out when it comes to forgiveness, and no arbitrary limits to the number of times in which we're to practice it. Now, this of course doesn't mean going back to relationships that are damaging and abusive, but forgiveness in these instances means getting to a point where you can move on, removed from harm's way, but where you can overcome bitterness and hatred, such that your life can be restored and renewed. Now, it might be that today you've remembered a grudge that you're holding on to, a person who you're struggling to forgive, or that you realise that you've in effect cut off a relationship with someone because of your own limits of forgiveness being reached. Well, maybe it's time to do something about it and to share the forgiveness that we know in Christ with others. And if you don't know the forgiveness that Christ offers for yourself, but would like to, then don't hesitate to bring that before God in prayer, to seek forgiveness, to talk to myself or to anyone else that is close to you in the life of the church. Because until we know God's forgiveness for ourselves, then we will find it nigh on impossible to offer it in its most transforming and renewing extent to others. Peter wants a number. He wants to know the limits that are to be placed on forgiveness. But in the end, he's asking the wrong question, because there is no limit to the forgiveness that we know in Jesus Christ. There is no limit to the forgiveness that we are to share with others as best we can by the grace of God.